We're talking today with Mr. Orley Van Dyke of Holland, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Orley, start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born on December 30, 1924, in an upstairs apartment in a house just north of the city of Holland.
Okay, so Holland, Michigan.
Holland, Michigan.
Okay, and then did you grow up in Holland?
I grew up my entire life in Michigan. In fact, as I grew up, right after I was born, we moved into a house on Lakewood Boulevard, and I grew up there until I went into the service in 1943.
All right. Now, what was your family doing for a living when you were a kid?
My dad was employed at the Holland furnace, and my mother was a young girl. My mother was, when I was born, was 18, and my dad was 20.
Mm-hmm.
And I was born in an upstairs apartment, and from the time I was born till 1926, 2 years later, we had moved to a house on Lakewood Boulevard.
Right. Okay. Now, did your mother stay home, or did she have a job?
No, my mother was a young woman, and she was a housewife her entire life. In fact, when my mother passed away, she didn't even have a Social Security number.
Wow.
She never worked out of the home.
Okay. Now, did your father have steady work through the 1930s?
Yeah, in 1920, from 1924 to 1931, that's when the Depression hit our family. He worked at the Holland furnace. He had steady work, and he was a not highly, but a good paying job up until the plant closed on kind of the Depression.
Okay. And so what did he do after that?
He continued working at the Holland furnace until they closed, I think, in 53 or 54, and then he got a part-time job, and he worked, drove school bus and worked at the unemployment office until he was 65, and then he retired.
Okay, so I guess I was trying to sort out what he did during the 1930s. So did he get less work in the 30s? But
No, he kept working in the Holland furnace. He was what they called a molder. He set up molds for furnace parts.
Okay, so he had a skilled job, and he was able to keep that job.
Yes.
Okay, all right. And then where did you go to high school? Where did you go?
I went to high school in Holland High School.
Okay.
I graduated out of the 8th grade in 1938, and in 1938 I started Holland High School.
Okay. All right. And were you still in high school when Pearl Harbor happened?
Yes, I was a 16-year-old senior, starting my senior year in high school in December 7 in 1941. And I was 16 years old, and I would have been 17 in 3 weeks.
Okay. Now, do you remember how you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Well, I think it happened on a Sunday, and I really don't think I heard much about it until I got to school on Monday morning. And then that was all the talk about Pearl Harbor. But and then, of course, I wanted to join you, but I wouldn't be 18 for another year. So.
Okay. Now, you could have enlisted when you were 17, but your parents would have to allow you to do that.
Right, and I knew my parents weren't signed.
Okay.
So I knew I had to wait till I was 18.
Okay. Now, did the start of the war, did that change daily life in Holland at all, or were there things happening now?
No, I don't think. I know the National Guard was called about the year before.
Right.
They left, but no, things did not change that I knew of in Holland.
Okay. Did they have rationing?
Well, yeah, rationing started. I think that was right after Pearl Harbor when the rationing, the sugar rationing, and the gasoline rationing. I know you got stickers for your car. I think you were allowed 4 gallons of gas a week or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So it's affecting things a little bit. Now, were there, did some of your classmates in high school, did they go off and enlist right away? Or?
Not that I know of. No, not. I don't believe any that I knew of any classmates enlisted. They were all almost too young. They were almost in the about 17 years old. but.
Yeah. Okay, so they stay in. So the older guys would go.
Oh yeah, right. The draft was on then. Yeah, sure. Oh yeah, right.
Okay, all right. And so, did you graduate from high school in '42 then?
Yes, I graduated in 1942. I took printing for 4 years in high school, and in April of 1942, the printing teacher called me over and said they had an opening at the newspaper. And so he said, if you got the job, took the job at the newspaper, I would get credit for my printing. And so I started working mornings at the newspaper, and afternoons I went to high school until June, and I graduated with my class.
Okay, all right. Now you were still were you still 16 or were you 17 now?
I was 17 when I graduated. Right. I was 17 years old, and I graduated in June.
Okay.
Right.
All right. And then did you just keep working for the paper then?
I worked after I graduated. I started working full time at the paper, and until I was 18, December 30 of 1942, and so. Right that next week, I went to Grand Rapids and I was going to enlist in the Marine Corps.
Okay.
But the Marines were no longer taking recruits. They were getting their men from the draftees that signed up for the Navy. And so the following week, I went to my draft board in Grand Haven and said, put me in the February quota for the Army. And February, I went to, first part of February, I went to Kalamazoo, signed up, passed my physical, and as you walked out, there was an Army man and a Navy man, and you told them which branch of the service you wanted. And I stopped by the Navy man and I said, I want the Marines. He said, the only way you're going to get in the Marines is if they choose you out of the Navy. So I said, put me down for the Navy. And I went and sat down, and I thought to myself, with your luck, you'll end up on a battleship in the middle of the ocean, and I'm not a water person. I went back in and I said, change me to the Army. And so I went in the end of February, I went to Grand Haven and left for the service.
All right. Now, where did they send you first? When you left Grand Haven, where do you go next?
We went to Chicago for dinner and got on another train and went to Camp Grant, Illinois, that's just outside of Rockford.
Now, was that just for processing there?
That was right. I got there on Saturday night, and we went to put us up in a barracks, and there was nothing doing on Sunday. And Monday morning, we started changing from civilians to Army. And I was there. I think it was there that we did a lot of testing. We took a lot of tests. And a few days later, I got on a troop train and we went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma.
Okay.
And I was assigned to a flash and sound battery. And I started my basic training, and I was just about finished with my basic training, and a fellow in the barracks came up to me and said, I'm going to go to the reception center at Fort Sill and apply to the Air Force. And if you had 2 years of college or passed the test, you could get into the Air Force. And if you passed the test, you would be either a pilot, navigator, or bombardier. And so I went with this fella, and as he took the test, and the Air Force sergeant said, "Why don't you take the test since you're waiting anyway?" So I said, "Okay." And it was a test for it was a multiple choice, and I think it was about a 3-hour test. And we finished taking the test, and the sergeant said, "I'll mark your papers." About 20 minutes later, he came back, and he said, "Van Dyke," he said, "you're now in the Air Force." And he said to the other fellow, he said, "You didn't pass, so you go back to the field artillery."
Okay. Now, I want to back up a little bit and fill in a few pieces of this story.
Okay.
You talked about taking a train ride from Chicago to Oklahoma.
No, we took a
From
train.
Rockford to Oklahoma.
Illinois.
Yeah. So Illinois to Oklahoma. What do you remember about that train ride?
It was cold. Going through the mountains there in Missouri, it was cold. We all had our great big Army overcoats on, and it was cold. And finally we got to Fort Sill, Oklahoma.
Okay. And then what was basic training like?
Well, the flash and sound, it was a regular basic training to the rifle range, but a flash and sound, you sat in a foxhole on front of the lines with a periscope looking for the flash of the enemy guns. Mm-hmm. And you recorded what you saw, and that went back to Central where they checked it, and that way, with all of the flash and sound reports, they knew where that flash came from, and they could.
Okay. All right. So Fort Sill is mainly an artillery base,
Yes,
and so this is kind of an adjunct to our
Right,
artillery.
right.
Okay. Now, you said you had standard basic training, and a lot of people today don't know what that is. So what do you do in a day, typical day, when you're in basic training?
Well, you get up early. Well, before I started my basic training, I got a call to go to the general. I had to go and see a general. And he said to me, he said, "With your IQ," he said, "you should be in officer's training. But," he said, "since you're only just 18 years old, we're going to send you to a company in the field artillery, flash and sound, and after you've been in the Army a while, we are going to call you for officer's training."
Okay.
So the regular basic training was marching, getting on your hands and knees, crawling under barbed wire with them shooting over you, and it was rough. And there were long hikes, and you never knew what time of the day you're going to get called out of the barracks, and you had to have everything inspected, and it was a rough life, but it was good for you.
All right. Now, how easy or hard was it for you to adjust to life in the Army?
I loved it. I loved the Army.
Okay. So even the discipline and all of that?
With the discipline and all. Well, I grew up under discipline. My father was a disciplinarian, mm-hmm. and we had to go according to his rules. Mm-hmm. And so I was used to being told what to do and what not to do.
Okay. All right. So, okay. So now that kind of fills in some of that. So now we're at the point in your story where basically you've now gone into the Air Force.
Okay.
Okay. So what happens to you next? So after that officer tells you, that sergeant or whatever, he tells you you're in, and now what happens?
Well, then I went back to my company, and they said, "Well, you're finished here. You're in the Air Force." They said, "So what we're going to do, we're going to let you paint the mess hall at night." So about 6 o'clock in the evening, after the mess hall was closed, I went in with a couple other guys, and we painted till about 3 or 4 in the morning. And we did that for, I would say, maybe a month.
Wow.
And then the orders came that we had to report to the Air Force recruiting office, and they took, with a bus, they took us to Shepherd Field, Texas. Mm-hmm. And there I joined a whole company of Air Force recruits that were going to go to college. And so I laid around in Shepherd Field, Texas for about 3 months waiting to get called to some college. And I think it was about the 1st of September of 1943 that we were sent to Kansas State College in Manhattan, Kansas.
All right. So how did you spend your time at Shepherd Field? What did you do?
Nothing, just marching, and we laid around most of the time waiting to go to college.
Okay. All right. Now, why did they think you had to go to college?
I don't know. That was part of the test that I took because we knew we were either going to be a pilot, navigator, or bombardier. And when you graduated from that school, you were a second lieutenant. So they figured we had to have three months of college training before we went to our
You get that before you got the flight training?
yeah, right. And then after, from September till just before Christmas, I went to school at Kansas State College.
All right.
And then we shipped out to Santa Ana, California for classification.
Okay. So when you were at Kansas State, did you have to take a lot of classes? Did you spend all of your time studying?
Well, yeah, most of the time. Yeah, we had a lot of classes. I know we took quite a few different classes, but we also had got 10 hours of flight training in Piper Cubs.
Okay.
And that's when I found out that I had bad depth perception, because after about 3 hours of flight training, the instructors told me that I was going to land the plane that day. And so we came in for a landing, and as I thought we were ready to touch ground, I pulled back on the throttle and pulled back on the stick, and the instructor grabbed the stick and pushed the throttle forward, and he said, "Are you trying to kill us?" He said, "We're 50 feet off the ground yet." So then I knew I had bad depth perception.
All right. So you went in thinking you were going to be a pilot, or they start you off to train all of you to be pilots?
No, you didn't know until after college whether you were going to be pilot, navigator, or bombardier.
Okay. All right. But you were actually getting pilot instruction.
You're right. We had 10 hours of flight training while we were in school.
Okay.
Right.
All right. So now they know you're going to be a navigator or a bombardier.
Bombardier,
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
But I went through all of the tests, not because they didn't know that. I knew it.
Right.
And I know one of the tests was they had a big long board with two sticks that you had to line up. And I said to them, I said, "Okay," and the guy said, "You can do better than that." So I said, "That's how best I can do," and so I knew I didn't pass that one, but I passed for bombardier or navigator.
Right. Okay. All right. So you get through with your 3 months at Kansas State, and now what happens?
After I was classified as bombardier, I took pre-flight with all bombardier students, and I was in California, from Santa Ana, California, from just before Christmas until about May of 1944 with pre-flight.
Okay.
And then I got sent to Kirtland Field in Albuquerque, New Mexico, to bombardier school.
Okay. So what do they do in pre-flight?
It was another basic training, typically, but it was a little bit different in the Air Force. You didn't have to march as much or crawl in the mud, or it was mostly studying and taking guns apart and going to the rifle range and things like that.
Okay. Now, did you learn anything about aeronautics or flying or weather or other things?
I didn't learn that until I got in bombardier school.
Okay. All right. So this is just sort of another more basic
More
level
of
of
a
training.
basic, it was another basic training, right. I remember every Sunday the whole camp had a march. And that year, out of the 3 or 4 months I was there, I remember it rained 7 Sundays. That we didn't have anything. We didn't have to march on Sunday. It was raining, and I know I had to go. One day I had to go to the dentist, and I had to walk in water about up to my ankles. It had rained so much. It was terrible wet that winter in Florida, in California.
Okay. Now, did you ever get to go off the base at
Oh
Santa
yeah,
Ana?
usually we had the weekend off, and we would take the electric train to Los Angeles.
And what could you do there?
But usually just going to the movies or to the burlesque show or to the bar, but typical weekend soldiers.
Okay. Now, did they have facilities for you in Los Angeles? I mean, you hear about things like the Hollywood Canteen and all of that kind of thing.
No, they didn't. I didn't know anything about that. We'd get a motel room with about 6 or 7 other guys, and we just got a motel room for that one night, that Saturday night. And I know towards the end there, when it got about 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, there would be guys that were stationed there. They would say, "You want to ride back to the base?" So we'd pay them, and they would take us back to Santa Ana, to our base.
All right. So you could be there for the marches.
Yeah, you had to be there Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon for the march. Yeah, right.
All right. So now finally we're getting into the middle of 1944 now, and you're finished with the pre-flight, and now you go to Kirtland
Field.
Right. Okay.
And
now that's bombardier school.
Right to bombardier school from, I would say, I think it was 16 or 18 weeks. And then if you passed, you graduated from bombardier school and you were commissioned a lieutenant or a flight officer.
Okay.
And that was, I think, in September or October when that time ended, and I was passed, and I was commissioned a flight officer, and I was given a 7-day furlough, which was the first time I could get to go home after 20 months in the Army.
Okay. Now, talk about bombardier school. What did you learn there?
Well, then we went to school, or every so often we would fly, and we would have two cadets to a plane, and they take us way out where they had targets, round circle targets, and you dropped 100-pound bombs, and one student would be doing the bombing, and the other student would be in the back of the airplane with a camera, and when the bomb would hit, a puff of smoke would come up, and you had to take a picture of it. And that way, you had in order to pass, you had to have all of your bombs within 150 feet of the bullseye.
Okay. Now, were you using a bomb sight?
Oh, definitely, right. Oh, yeah. And then we also went on trainers. They were like big step ladders, and then you would sit with a bomb sight, and then you would line up on a target, and then like a bobbin would go down. And so we did that, and then we had weather classes, and we also had navigation classes. It was almost a combination of navigating and bombing. And the last, well, no, that was in combat crew training that we had on 1,000 Mile.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
But,
Okay. So, so now you're actually learning more about what you will do as a
What we're going to
bombardier
do,
and
right.
how that works. Okay. So you finish at Kirtland Field. Where do you go next?
Then
You had your leave.
I had my leave, and I had to go to Lincoln, Nebraska. And at Lincoln, Nebraska, all the bombardier students, the navigating students, the pilot students, the gunnery students, the radar operators all came to Lincoln, Nebraska, and there they made you into crews. That's where you got your crew, and I was there till I think I was only in Lincoln about a month. And then we went to Alamogordo, New Mexico to combat crew training.
Okay.
And that's where we started flying old beat-up B-29s for combat crews.
Okay. All right. And that's where you flew 1,000 miles? Or?
No, and then our last, before we shipped out of Alamogordo, we had to take a 3,000-mile flight west. We had to fly over Los Angeles and out into the ocean and then back, because they knew that when we got overseas, we would be stationed on one of the islands, and that was a 3,000-mile round trip from our base to Japan and back.
Okay.
So,
all right. Now, so basically, are you now with the crew that you're going to be serving
I'm with the crew in Alamogordo.
Okay.
Right.
So talk a little bit. What do you remember about those guys?
Well, we got to know each other. This is what these guys on the crew, you fly with them, you live with them, you get to be brothers. I mean, they tell you about their family and you tell them about you get to be very close to them. I know even after the war, as a crew, we all got to fly back home. And I kept up with our crew every year. I kept up with them with Christmas cards and telling them what we had done and that. No, we were very, very close as a crew. Got to know the guys real well.
Okay. So who was your pilot?
Our pilot was Les Gilbert. He was an original Floridian. He was born and raised in Florida, and he was the first person I ever knew that was not from the Midwest. And I remember when we were in Alamogordo, his mother used to send him bushels of fruit, oranges and grapefruit and all kinds of Florida fruit. And I remember Les, when he'd get a basket of his mother, he would bite into the orange and he would just squeeze the juice out and then he'd throw the rest of the orange away. And this to me was unknown to do that.
All right.
Yeah, right.
Okay. Now, who was the oldest guy in the crew?
Our oldest guy was the radar operator. He was 26 and we called him Pop. And he was from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I got to be very, very close to him. Even after the war, we would go to Philadelphia and we would take trips. We went to Canada with him a couple times, and we were very, very close to him. He was 26 years old, and he was the oldest on the crew.
All right. And usually in the military, there's supposed to be some distance between the officers and the enlisted men. With a flight crew, do you have that, or are you
well, the only way with the flight crew that we were different is there were 5 officers and 6 enlisted men on the crew. Well, we lived in different Quonset huts than the enlisted men, but when we got to the line, you were all the same. There was no difference. I guess I shouldn't even say this, but when we got overseas, we got to know some of the Navy pilots. There was on Guam, there was a place where the Navy, that was a big Navy, and they had a big Quonset hut where you could get beer or drinks. And then if we didn't have anything to do, some of us officers would go, and we got to know some of these Navy pilots, and they would take us to their ships, and we would eat with those guys, and then they would invite us back. And so if we would say to a couple of our enlisted men that we'd put lieutenant's bar on them, and they'd go with us, and they would make believe they were officers too, and then we'd eat with them guys, because those Navy officers had it made on the ships, because they ate separate, and we all ate together, and we was.
Yeah. So you were still getting Army food. You're not the Air Force isn't a separate branch yet. So the Navy has better food.
Well, the Navy officers did. I know on those little aircraft carriers or ships they were on, the Navy men and officers would all sit in a room with a big round table. They'd all sit around that table and eat. Where we ate, we all ate together. We all sat wherever we wanted to. But
right. Now, when you were on the Navy ships, did they have black stewards serving you?
Yes, they did. Yeah, they did. And they had signs, a lot of signs up, officers' country. And then they would say, the Navy guys would say, stay tonight for the movie. And then they would get chairs out for us, and we'd sit on chairs and watch the movie, where when we at our base, we sat on logs. We didn't have for our movie theaters.
All right. So when do you actually go overseas?
When I went overseas?
When did you go? Yeah.
We left Alamogordo in April, and we went to Kearney, Nebraska, and picked up a brand new airplane. And I called my girlfriend, and I said, we're going to, or I called her before we went to Kearney, and I said, we're going to Kearney, Nebraska, and then we're going to go overseas. Well, she said, I'm going to come and see you before you leave. I said, I might be gone. But she said, I'm coming anyway. So she came to Kearney, and we were there about a week, I guess, calibrating instruments on our new airplane, flying and getting ready to go overseas. Well, she came, and the night, I knew we were going to leave the next day, and we were restricted to the base. And we decided to get married. So we got married in the afternoon. Our crew went and had dinner at the PX, and she stayed till about 8 o'clock, and she went to her hotel. I went to the barracks. The next morning we left. I went west, she went east. And I didn't see her again until I came home after the end of the war. And then we flew to Sacramento, California. And then I had to have all my papers changed for dependents, and we were in Sacramento about maybe a week, and then we got orders that we were leaving, flying to Hawaii, and we couldn't look at our orders until we were over the ocean, and then flew about an hour, and we opened up the orders, and we were going to Guam. And so we flew to Hawaii. We were there about a week. Then we flew to Kwajalein, overnight at Kwajalein, and from Kwajalein to Guam.
Okay. So in Hawaii, did you get to be a tourist? Did you go to the beach?
Yes, we did. We went. I know we took the bus from the base to downtown Hawaii, Honolulu, and it looked like Monday morning. It was completely white with soldiers, with Navy men, all in their white uniforms. And we only were in Hawaii, in Honolulu, a little while. and then we went to the beach, and it was beautiful there. At night we'd sit by the officers club and sit out in the open, and nice warm weather, and it was beautiful. And when we took off from Hawaii to Kwajalein, we flew the Dole Pineapple Company had a big water tower shaped like a pineapple, and we flew right over that water tower on our way to Kwajalein.
Okay, so you do Kwajalein, and eventually you get to Guam.
Then we're to Guam.
Okay, and then what kind of facilities did you have at Guam?
Well,
what was there?
Guam, they only had, we were one of the first replacement crews to the 330th Bomb Group. Now, in fact, they were still working on the runway when we landed. And they took us to our Quonset hut. There were two crew officers from two crews in one Quonset. Well, they took us, our crew, our 5 officers, they took us to a Quonset hut as a replacement crew that had got shot down a couple days before. So when we came into the Quonset hut with that other crew, we were not too much welcome, because they had just lost all their friends that had been in that Quonset hut before us. But it didn't take long. We got to be friends with that crew too. So.
Okay. Now,
And then we got married on 18th of April. We flew to Matherfield, Hawaii, Kwajalein, and we flew our first combat mission on May 4.
okay.
And before we flew on combat missions, we flew a couple training missions. We bombed a little island off the coast of Guam, Rota. And that's where there were still Japanese on that island, that they had been bypassed by the Japanese Navy. They were just living off the land.
Right.
And so they knew when we were leaving on a mission, because we flew over that little island. So,
Okay.
but then we practiced bombing a couple times that runway that was there, and then May 4 we flew our first mission.
Okay. Now, what do you remember about that first mission?
Well, the first mission, from Guam to Japan, was 1,500 miles. And so it took 6 hours. We flew for 6 hours. Well, you can't fly in formation for 6 hours. So you flew individually. And the navigator was told, given a point off the coast of Japan for our group to meet. Well, the lead plane would take off first, and we would all individually fly to that point. Well, when we got there, the lead crew would have the nose wheel of their plane dropped, and he would be circling, and we would all circle and get in formation. And we usually our formation was a lead plane, a plane on each wing, and then one in the slot, back of the lead plane. That we had 4 planes, and then we would take off for our target.
All right.
And I remember that first mission was a airfield on Kyushu, and I can remember we were all tense, and finally that lead plane, I saw the bomb bay doors go open, so we opened our bomb bay doors. I don't even think I looked at the bomb site that mission, because I just dropped the bombs on the lead plane and I was looking and watching all them Japanese running around, and there were all airplanes lined up, and they didn't have hardly any fuel, so they weren't doing much flying. And I don't think there was very little flak that first mission, and we dropped our bombs and went back out got over the coast, and then we broke up, and then we all flew individually back. But they told us, don't waste time getting in formation, because you don't have that much gas. and if you use too much gas, you won't have enough to make it back to Guam. And luckily, shortly after we started bombing Japan, then the Marines had taken Iwo Jima. So if you knew you were going to run out of gas, you could stop in Iwo Jima and get gas and load up with gas. But we had a good airplane. We got good gas mileage, and so we never had to stop for gas in Iwo Jima. We could make it back.
All right. Now you said that when you were on this mission, you could see the Japanese on the ground.
Oh yeah.
How high were you? What was your altitude?
I think it might have been around between 12,000 feet and 9,000.
Okay.
I know the book. I got the book on the 330th that tells about every mission and about the altitude. And usually, see, that's why when Curtis LeMay took over the 20th Air Force, they were flying B-29s out of China. And they were flying at 30-some thousand feet.
Right.
And they weren't hitting anything. They didn't know about the air, what do they call that? Air, that wind.
Right. So you can have the effects of the wind and all
the
of that.
wind. Well,
Yeah.
they were missing. Well, when Curtis LeMay took over, he said, "You guys are going to go in at between 12,000 and 9,000 feet." He said, "So you can start hitting something." Well, they told LeMay, "You're going to lose everybody." We said, "That's what we're going to do." So that's what we were flying at. So I'd say we were maybe at 10,000 feet, something like that.
Okay.
But I could see all those Japanese soldiers running around.
Right. Okay. Now that, they're concerned because the enemy anti-aircraft fire can hit you at that level. Enemy fighter planes could get you at that level. But that first mission was pretty quiet.
Oh, very quiet. Well, then shortly after that, we started doing night missions. And most of our missions were night missions. And you flew up individually. You flew to your initial point. And usually our initial point was Mount Fujiyama, because Mount Fujiyama you could see miles and miles away already. You flew up to Mount Fujiyama, and then the bombardier would tell the pilot what course to head for. But you really didn't have to tell the pilot, because all you had to do was look out and you could see a big fire. Well, you knew that was where you had to go. So the pilot headed for that fire.
All right.
And then with the night missions, we dropped our bombs. The radar operator and the bombardier would work together, and he would give me points to put on the bomb site, and then we would drop our bombs according to the radar operator. And that was most of our missions were night missions.
Okay. Now, and were you dropping incendiary bombs?
Oh yeah, we dropped little. Well, they were all made up into one bomb, but they were little bombs. They were only about 18 inches long and not very big. They were 5-pound magnesium bombs, and the only way you could put those out is with sand. Water didn't put them out, and the Japanese built all their houses around the factory. Well, you just with one big bomb, like one B-29 could almost take out the whole city of Grand Rapids, because them little 5-pound bombs, they were made into 500-pound bombs, and then they would go, you drop them, and then them straps would go up, and then bombs would just scatter all over, and everything would burn up. There. It was, and then every so often, maybe 1 out of 20 planes would have high explosive bombs, and then they would drop and they would scatter that fire all over, and it was bad. It was bad.
Yeah. When you were doing the flying, were you thinking at all about the effect it was having on the people on the ground, or were you just doing your job?
Well, one day after we had dropped flown quite a few missions, the radar operator and I went to the chaplain, and we had told him, we said, this is not right that we kill all those people. Well, the chaplain said, well, that's war, and it wasn't that we were trying to destroy a factory. It was the city.
Yep.
You were bombing the city. So
So on some level, you were aware of that.
well, yeah, right. We went and talked to the chaplain about it. Yeah, him and the rear operator and I. We went and talked to the chaplain.
Okay. So how many missions did you fly?
We flew 24 missions, but a couple of those missions were show of force because after we had the war, after we had dropped the atomic bomb, then we would fly real low over Japan, and I know some of those, a couple of those missions, we'd fly, or were very low, and you could see the people were all looking up. They couldn't comprehend that all those airplanes that, and then we sent before we would drop bombs on a city, a couple of days before we would have planes fly over and drop leaflets and tell the people, we're going to bomb your city. If you want to be safe, get out of town, because so we did give warning towards the end there, that we gave warning, because people don't realize it would have been mass murder if we would have had to invade Japan, because the kids were all prepared, and it was. People don't realize what it would have been like. I know about a month before the war ended, there were trucks and jeeps and tanks. Guam was so full of equipment, all ready for the invasion. And I found out about a month before the war ended, they built a new airfield. We were at Northfield. They built a new airfield they call Northeast Field, and that was for B-29s, but they flew their missions without gunners. And now I find out, after I talked to some other guys that were on that field, those planes were that field was made for B-29s to drop supplies during the invasion. That's what that field was for, because those crews just flew without gunners or without guns, just dropped bombs, but they were going to load the bomb bays up with tanks and trucks and drop supplies in the invasion.
Okay, let's go back to your own missions. Did you have problems with anti-aircraft fire? Was that a regular thing?
Oh yeah, anti-aircraft. We always hit a lot of anti-aircraft during missions, but at night the sky would be full of searchlights searching, and if you got caught in one of those searchlights, which we did a couple times, then they were all synchronized on the ground, and they would all get on you, and then the anti-aircraft. Well, we had what we called little rolls of aluminum foil that we called rope, and the radio operator would go to the back of the plane by the camera hatch, and he would throw that rope out, and then the searchlights would go onto that rope, and then they would follow that rope down, and then they would come off on us. And we had that happen a couple of times, that we'd get caught in the searchlights, especially over Tokyo and Yokohama, and it would be so light in that airplane, it would be just like sitting here. You could read a book, and then the pilot would kind of put the nose of the plane down. And I know one night I looked at the speedometer. We were going 312 miles an hour, and Joe, the cameraman, was throwing rope out, and the searchlights all went off on us, and so we got in the clear again.
Okay. Now you mentioned that Joe could get a little bit overexcited, or you talked about one incident throwing out the rope where it
Yeah.
where it didn't work quite the way it was supposed to.
No, Joe was kind of a nervous, and the radio operator over Japan didn't have anything to do. So that was Joe. Joe was kind of a nervous guy anyway, and so he went with the box of rope to the back of the plane and took the cover off the camera hatch, and we were flying along. It was over Tokyo, and we got caught in the searchlights. And I said, Joe, throw out the rope, and he threw out the whole box. And when we landed back on Guam that morning, the whole back of the airplane looked like a Christmas tree. A lot of that rope had blown back into the plane. But,
All right.
But at least we got rid of the searchlights.
Okay. Now you also had an in-air collision at one point, right?
Well, yeah, and that was one of the. That was just before the end of the war, and this was an all-out mission on a factory just outside of Tokyo, and there were a lot of us planes, formation planes in a row, going to drop our bombs, and that lead plane decided to slow up. Well, with a huge airplane, by the time that slowing up got to us guys in the back, well, the planes were going different. Well, finally, this one plane that was in our formation got right over us, and it was so I could read the bomb, the numbers on the bombs, and the tail of our plane, we had lost an engine. We were flying on 3 engines, and the tail of our plane went into the bomb bay of this plane above us, and ripped off a big piece of the tail of our plane. And I said, "Oh Lord, don't let him drop to the bombs, because he would have taken me along with it."
Yep.
And finally, our pilot got the nose down, and we got out of formation. And years later, a fellow sent me a picture that somebody had taken of our plane. We were all by ourselves, and you could see the plane where the tail had been taken off, and one of the engines was out. We had lost two engines that day, but we got one started again, and we were flying on 3 engines, and so then we flew back on 3 engines back to Iwo, and that's the only time we had to stop in Iwo.
Okay. So you did stop there once.
Then we landed. A lot of planes after that mission. A lot of planes were landing on Iwo, and we landed our plane on Iwo, and they were ready to bulldoze our airplane back and off the runway into the ocean. And we said, no, we don't want to lose our airplane. So they kept it, and they repaired the tail in Iwo, and most of us flew back on different airplanes, but they flew some of our ground crew from Guam to Iwo, and they repaired our plane, and then they flew it back.
Okay. So the airstrip at Iwo, that was long enough to take a B-29 off from.
It was long enough, but there were so many that wanted to land.
Yeah.
And they had to get that runway clear. So instead of trying to just push our plane off and let another plane land, we said, no, well, they would have pushed it into the ocean then, because,
So you had some place where you could park the plane.
Yeah, there was a place then that they could get it off the runway, and they could park it. Yeah.
All right.
I know we stayed overnight on Iwo, but there were still Japs on Iwo, and That was kind of a scary night. You never knew the Japs were coming out. So.
Yeah, I guess there was one point when a bunch of them came out from under someplace
Oh,
and,
yeah,
and attacked the airstrip.
Oh, they had all caves and yeah, right,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And then, let's see, did you have incidents where you took damage from anti-aircraft fire? Did your plane ever get hit?
Oh, we got hit. We got hit by flak a lot. And this one mission, I think it was Yokohama. We had dropped our bombs, and we were flying. Maybe no, I don't think we had dropped our bombs yet. We were coming up to Yokohama, and all of a sudden, sky just turned black. You could have walked on it, and I thought, oh no, we got to fly through that. And well, we got through it, and I could see, sitting right in the front of it, I could see pieces of the plane flying off, and we got through, dropped our bombs, and we got over the ocean again, and the radar operator was very quiet. He sits all by himself in the back, and it's dark. You don't see nothing. He said, "Well, I got a window now." He said, and he had a hole. It was about 4 inches above his head. That there was a hole in the airplane, and that flak had gone right over his head. If it would have been just a little bit lower, it would have taken his head right off. But so he had a hole in his head and a hole in the plane. But we could hear the flak hitting different planes, parts of the airplane. We were far enough away from it that it didn't have enough force to go through the plane, but that piece of flak was close to the plane that it could go right through the plane. And
okay. Now, did you ever see any Japanese aircraft?
oh yeah, one day we were flying a day mission, and like I said, we had to circle the lead plane. Well, we were going to be on the right wing. There was going to be the lead plane. We were going to be on the right wing, and another plane on the left wing, and one in the slot. Well, this was a kind of a new crew. They hadn't flown too many missions yet. Well, they got on our place on the wing, and so our pilot said, "Well, I'll just take the slot." So we got in the slot, and we were flying along, and of course, I'm sitting in the nose, and all of a sudden, I could see a shadow fly across right in front of me, and I didn't know what that was. Well, I looked out, and that plane where we were supposed to be dropped out of formation, and he started going down. And then I saw 6 men jump out of the back of the plane, and the plane kept going down, circled down, and I watched it crash. And I know those 5 guys in the front of the plane, none of those 5 guys got out, but the 6 guys in the back, they all got out, and I saw them 6 parachutes, and I saw that fighter plane go around circle and shoot them as they were floating down.
Wow. That
Fighter machine gun them 6 guys, and they evidently he killed them all because they were still all listed as missing in action, but they all got killed, and that plane was flying in our place.
Right.
So I had somebody else protecting us. There was somebody watching over us. Right.
Yeah. Now, did you had guns and gunners on your plane, right?
Oh yeah. We had, of course, with the B-29, the gunners were not near the gun. The guns were on the top and bottom turret, and then in the back there were two turrets, and the gunners sat towards the back of the plane. The one gunner on this side, one gunner on that side, and in the middle they called them the central control fighter, gunner. He sat on what they called the barber chair, and he sat on a chair up, and he could look through the top of the plane, so he could look 360 because the chair swiveled. He had a 360, and then of course he had the tail gunner. So he had 1, 2, 3, 4 gunners, and they had a gun sight by them, and that gun sight had you looked into that gun sight and there was a circle of lights. The farther away the fighter was, you put that circle around that fighter, and the closer he got, you made that circle bigger, and then it was all on a computer then. And the bombardier, I was in charge of the guns because, well, I could shoot in the front, but also on the barber chair he could shoot, or if their fighters was coming this way, the left gunner would shoot, or so.
Okay. And you had, and the turrets, were some of these sort of basically remote control? I mean, the turret is up here, but the people are controlling it from elsewhere.
They're sitting different, right. There were four guns here, and 4 guns here, and 4 here, and 4 here. So there'd be 16 guns, plus the tail gunners could shoot.
All right.
Yeah.
Do you know if your plane ever shot anything down?
Our tail gunner claims that he shot a fighter down, but you had to have proof. He said, I know I shot that plane down, but there was no proof.
Right.
None of our other gunners, because he was in the back, but we had never, we never had credit for shooting a plane down. No.
All right.
No.
And were fighters only a problem during the day?
Yeah. Right.
Okay, so
right. Yes. And the Japanese, we took out all their oil refineries. That was what they started doing.
Right.
Well, the Japanese didn't have much fuel. But the only cities they could take care of would be like Tokyo or Yokohama or Osaka or Kobe. They could take, but those, and then we bombed after the oil refineries. Then we started bombing the airfields, and the Navy pilots that we talked to, they said, now you guys flying over Japan, you let us know where these airfields are or where the ships are, that we can go and bomb them. So we'd have to, if we met them pilots from them little aircraft carriers, we'd say, well, there's an airfield over here, or there's an airfield over here, or there's ships over here, and so
All right.
we worked together.
Okay. Now, do you remember hearing about the atomic bomb being dropped?
We were coming back from a mission in August, and on the radio, they had said that we had dropped a bomb and wiped out a city, and trees were blown over, made such a wind, and we couldn't comprehend. We didn't. And then by the time we landed, well, then it was all over the news, that we had a bomb that they had dropped, and well, we didn't know anything about it. We didn't know a thing about it. Well, then they told us that Hiroshima had been wiped out, and then a couple of days later they dropped another bomb on Nagasaki, and we knew nothing about it. But that plane, I think, that the planes that dropped the atomic bomb, I think, were on Tinian, and they were. They had to make a special chute to drive the airplane over it, and that bomb was underneath. They had to lift it up into, modify the belly of the plane, and but no, we didn't know anything about that.
And then shortly after that, then the Japanese surrender.
Yeah, right. But then there was a crew, one of the crews that from our 330th Bomb Group, they had got shot down. And after the war was over, but we were still on Guam, and when this crew came back, and we got to talk to those guys, and they had been taken captive. They had parachuted out of their plane, and a little island off in Japan, they were right near that, and them Japanese came and got them, and they were captive, and they were put in prison, and they were taken by the Japanese to Hiroshima. And this one guy told me, he said, they blindfolded us and they laid their swords on our necks. And then they made us look at what, and we figured they were going to chop our head off, but they didn't. They let us go. And then I know after the war.
That was your microphone falling out. All right.
I'm walking.
There you go. Should stay there for a while. Okay.
I know after the war, then we didn't, as a bombardier, I didn't have to go. They just took a skeleton crew and they loaded the bomb bays up with supplies, and then they would take them to these prisoner of war camps. And then I know this one guy that had come back, he said, when they dropped the supplies, he said, we started beating them Japanese up. He said, because they ran after them supplies too. And he said, we started beating them up, and to get out of there, them are for us. And he said some of them Japanese, they just walked away from the prisoner of war camp. They just let us be. They didn't want anything to do with us anymore. So, but and then when they signed the peace treaty, then we flew over the battleship Missouri, and then we watched the Marines land on Japan, and they took over, went and got stationed in Japan, and we were given orders: do not land on Japan, do not land in Japan. And there was another city that we might not bomb, and that was Kyoto. And that was just out of Japan, and that was an old city with all the old buildings, and we were told, you do not bomb that city. So we couldn't bomb Kyoto.
Right. Okay. So then, once the war's over, how long was it before you got to go back to the States?
Well, I think it was September when they signed the peace treaty. So then we laid around, and then they start making us fly. They were going to start checking out. See, we had an airplane commander and a pilot, and the airplane commander sat in the left seat and the pilot. Well, they start checking these pilots out to make them airplane commanders. Well, we start losing for some reason. And so we didn't go for that. So we didn't do much. If we could get out of flying, we got out of flying. Well, then after the war, the way they discharged the guys were the length of service, the length of time you were in the service, the time you spent overseas in combat. That all added up. Well, one day they told us, you're going to fly, you guys are going to go home. Your crew is going to go home. You're high enough on points. Well, so we got packed up, and we got to the plane, and there were 10 guys standing there, high point men from India. They had flown them guys from India to Guam, and they were going to fly home with us. And now when I think about it, why I flew home then as an observer. they didn't need a bombardier, so
Right.
I sat where the left gunner sat, and those 10 guys stood up all the way home from Guam to the United States. And I thought, now why didn't I go? They were in the radar, where the radar operator was, standing there, them 10 guys. I thought, why didn't I go in there and say to one of them guys, hey, come on and sit down here where I sit. I'll stand up for a while. But, you know, you're so anxious to get home. And I know this one guy had a little cage that he had made out of bamboo, and he had a parrot in there. And he guarded that parrot all the way home. And I mean, we did stop. We stopped in Kwajalein, and then we stopped again in Hawaii for a couple of days. And those guys did get, you know, they did get to sit down.
Yeah.
But when the flight time, they stood up all the way. That poor guy that, you know, I could have just as well said to one of them guys, hey, come and sit down here a while. But you were anxious to get home too, you know.
Okay. So where did you land in the continental U.S.?
We landed in, we landed in Mather Field in, I think it was just outside of Sacramento, Pittsburgh, I think. It's a little town, Pittsburgh, and we landed there, and then we got on, we were there. I know when we landed, we could go to the mess hall, and they had, never saw a mess hall like that in my life. They had all kinds of, they had ham, they had chicken, they had beef, they had pork, they had the best of everything, and you could pick out whatever you wanted. And coming home from Guam, we landed in Hawaii, and we were in line at the mess hall, and the cook said, well, what do you want? Well, I have a couple eggs. So the pilot Gilbert, he said, I want a dozen eggs. So I didn't know where you're going to get them. Well, then pretty soon the guy said, where's the guy who wanted a dozen eggs? He said, here they are. So handed Gilbert a tray with a dozen fried eggs on it. So, but that mess hall in California, that was really with everything that you wanted. While we were there a couple of days, and then we got on a troop train, and we slowly on. Well, when we got to, I think it was a couple of days, we got to Chicago, and then I think, I know it wasn't Camp Grant, Fort Sheridan, I think they called
North
it.
of Chicago.
Yeah, that's where we got, and I know there were a lot of German prisoners of war there. I can remember them talking German, and I was there a couple of days, and then I got my discharge, and but I don't think I actually got discharged till I think January of 46.
But you went home before that.
Oh yeah. I think I got home right after Thanksgiving, because it was, yeah.
Okay, all right. So now you're out of the Army. You get to rejoin your wife finally.
Yeah, finally joined, yeah, right. And you know, this is what really makes me mad yet today. I was in such a hurry to get home. Why didn't I call my wife and say, get on a train and meet me in Chicago, and we'll stay at the YMCA for a couple of days, and then but no, I got my discharge. I went right to the train station. I said, I'll be home at 6 o'clock tonight. You know, you do dumb things. But anyway, it all worked out. So,
All right.
we were married almost 72 years. So.
All right. Now, once you got back home, and then did you go back to work for the newspaper?
Well, then, of course, I got home. Well, then we had to look for a place to live. Well, all the time during the war, there was no building going on. And after the war, there were thousands of guys that got married. Well, I put an ad in the paper, and I think I got 3 or 4 calls. I remember one guy called and said, you might have to do a little work. It was a back porch. He had onions stored on there, and there's no way you could. Well, then we got lucky. There was an upstairs apartment. The lady that lived downstairs had Alzheimer's. Well, at that time they called it hardening of the arteries.
Okay.
Well, her sister called and said she's got an apartment you can rent. It was furnished.
Right.
So, oh yeah, we grabbed that for $25 a month. And so we took that apartment, and I was home about a week, and I said to my wife, I said, I'm going to go and talk to the guys at the Sentinel. And I got to the Sentinel, and I walked in there and started talking to the guys, and the boss came up to me and said, Orley, come back to work. We need you. He said, we're so short-handed. I said, I only been home a week. He said, come back to work. So I said, okay. So I was home a week, and I went back to work. And I stayed there until 1977. And then my wife's parents had a furniture store, and they wanted to retire. So we took over the furniture store in 1970, and I kept on working at the Sentinel. My wife ran the store, and I delivered it in afternoons. Well, in 1977, my wife had health problems with asthma. She said, we either have to get out of the store or you have to quit. So I said, okay, I'm going to quit. So I came in the store full time, and then we had the store till 1983, and then the building we were in, they were sold it, and I started working for the city for 10 years in the summer, and we went to Florida in the winter, and so until I got.
All right.
Yeah. So.
Okay. So now, when you look back on it, look back at the time that you spent in the service. How do you think that affected you, or what did you learn from that?
I think every young person should be in the Army because you learn discipline. Now, to me personally, I could say, like some guys used to say, I found a home in the Army. I could say I found a home in the Army. I liked it. Like I say, I was used to being disciplined at home. My father was a disciplinarian, and I was used to being told what to do. So that didn't bother me. And I was a young kid, and when I think back now, I wanted to get out of the house because my dad was a disciplinarian, and I came from a big family. My mother had 12 kids. I was the oldest, and there was always a bunch of little kids in the house. I wanted to get out of the house, so I got out of the house, and I enjoyed the Army. I can actually say I loved the Army. Right. It taught me everything. It grew me up. It made a man out of me instead of being a boy. That's what I think I got out of the Army.
All right. Well, the whole thing makes for a very good story, so I'd just like to thank you for taking the time to share it today.
Oh, well, yeah, right.
All right.
Right.